On April 23, 1951, in the freezing mountains of central Korea, 700 Australian soldiers stood against 10,000 Chinese troops. They had no air support, no reinforcements, just 5 hours of ammunition and a hill they were ordered to hold at all costs. What happened in the next 48 hours would shock the Chinese commanders who attacked them, the American generals who watched it unfold, and the war correspondents who tried to make sense of what they were seeing. This is the Battle of Kapyong, the day a small group of Australian and Canadian soldiers stopped the Chinese army cold and saved the city of Seoul. What you are about to hear is a story most people have never been told, not in textbooks, not in documentaries, not in the schools of the countries who fought it. It is the story of 3 days in April 1951. 3 days that decided the fate of a city and saved an entire war from being lost. And the man who ordered the attack, he would spend the next 30 years refusing to talk about what happened on that hill. To understand what happened at Kapyong, you have to understand what was happening to the United Nations forces in April of 1951. For 10 months, the Korean War had swung back and forth like a pendulum. In June 1950, North Korea invaded the South. By August, they had pushed the Americans and South Koreans into a tiny corner around the city of Busan. Then General Douglas MacArthur did the impossible. He landed an army at Incheon behind enemy lines. And by October, UN forces were pushing into North Korea, heading straight for the Chinese border. That's when Mao Zedong made his decision. 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River. They wore quilted uniforms. They moved at night, and they fought like nothing the Americans had ever seen. The Americans had names for them: the Ghost Army, the Phantom Soldiers. Entire divisions would disappear into the Korean mountains by day and reappear at night, often within hand grenade range of American positions. They did not fight by the rules the Americans had been trained for. They did not retreat when they should have retreated. They did not surrender when they were surrounded. And they did not stop, not for casualties, not for weather, not for anything. By January 1951, they had pushed UN forces back below Seoul. By March, the lines had stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel. And then, on April 22, 1951, the Chinese launched what they called the Fifth Phase Offensive, the largest single attack of the entire war. 300,000 men, 27 divisions, one objective: take Seoul back, end the war. And standing in their way, in a small valley called Kapyong, were the men of the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade. The 27th Brigade was a mixed force: the Middlesex Regiment, British; the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, Scottish; and 2 units that would carry the weight of what came next: the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, known as 3RAR, 700 men, and the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, another 700 men. These weren't fresh troops. They had been fighting in Korea for months. They had buried their friends at battles most of the world had already forgotten: Pakchon, the Apple Orchard, the Broken Bridge. The Australians were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson, a career soldier, hard-faced, pragmatic, the kind of officer who never raised his voice because he never needed to. The Canadians were led by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Stone. He had fought in Italy during World War II. He had seen what happens when men are pushed beyond what they can endure. Both commanders knew something was coming. On the afternoon of April 22nd, the South Korean 6th Division, holding the line in front of them, broke. 20,000 South Korean soldiers came pouring back through the Australian and Canadian positions, some without weapons, some without boots, all of them running, and behind them was the Chinese 118th Division, 10,000 men, moving fast, heading straight for Seoul. The only thing standing between them was a hill. The hill had a number, Hill 504. That's where Colonel Ferguson positioned his Australians. It was steep, it was rocky, and it sat directly over the road the Chinese needed to take Seoul. To the west of the road, another hill, Hill 677. That's where the Canadians dug in. Between them and the Chinese was a small village called Kapyong. The Australians had time to dig shallow trenches, set up machine gun nests, lay out their Bren guns, light machine guns that fired about 500 rounds a minute. They were supported by a company of New Zealand artillery, the 16th Field Regiment, 24 guns, the most reliable allies in Korea. And one more thing, 15 American Sherman tanks from the 72nd US Tank Battalion parked at the base of Hill 504. But here's what the Australians didn't have. They didn't have enough ammunition for a sustained fight. They didn't have air support, the weather was too poor for the planes, and they had no idea that they were about to be hit by a force more than 10 times their size. The temperature dropped below freezing as darkness came. The soldiers checked their weapons one last time. Some ate cold rations. Some wrote letters home they never finished. Others simply sat in their trenches, staring out into the valley below, listening for any sound that might tell them how close the Chinese were. And in the distance, just beyond the ridgelines, they could hear it. The unmistakable sound of thousands of men moving in the dark. Whistles, cymbals, voices. The Chinese 118th Division was forming up for the attack. As the sun set on April 23rd, Colonel Ferguson walked the line. He spoke to each company commander. He gave them one order: hold your ground. No retreat, no surrender. Hold. And then, at 3:47 a.m., the first shot was fired. They came in waves. The Chinese soldiers of the 118th Division had a tactic that terrified American troops. They didn't attack in lines. They attacked in human waves, hundreds of men at a time, running uphill in the dark, blowing whistles, crashing cymbals, screaming. Their goal wasn't to outshoot the defenders, it was to overwhelm them. A company of 3 RAR was on the forward slope of Hill 504. They saw the first wave coming up the hill and they opened fire with everything they had. Bren guns cutting through the dark, rifle shots in volleys, grenades rolling down the slope. The first Chinese wave fell, then a second wave came up over the bodies of the first, then a third. By 4 a.m., the Chinese had reached the Australian trenches. What followed was hand-to-hand combat, bayonets, rifle butts, knives in the dark. One Australian soldier of A Company would later describe it like this: "They came at us like they didn't care if they died, and maybe they didn't." Within an hour, A Company's forward position was overrun. They fell back to a second line of defence, then a third. In the chaos, runners moved between positions carrying ammunition, dragging wounded men behind boulders, shouting coordinates above the gunfire. Officers had stopped giving orders by megaphone. There was no point. The fighting was now too close, too personal. Men were defending the soldier next to them. Nothing else mattered. One Australian platoon commander would later say that he gave up trying to count the dead. He gave up trying to coordinate the line. He simply did what every man around him was doing. He fought, and he kept fighting, until either the sun came up or he didn't. By 6 a.m., the Australians had lost their forward slopes, but they still held the crest of Hill 504. And then something extraordinary happened. The American tanks at the base of the hill, 15 Shermans, turned their main guns up the slope, and they fired their high explosive shells directly at the Chinese formations now occupying the lower positions. The Chinese, exposed on the open hillside, were torn apart. For 4 hours the battle raged across Hill 504, and by 10 in the morning the Chinese pulled back. The Australians had held, but the cost was terrible: 32 Australians dead, 53 wounded, 3 captured, and the Chinese commander had not given up. He had simply turned his attention to the other hill. Hill 677. Colonel Jim Stone had been watching the battle on Hill 504 from his own command post on Hill 677. He had heard the gunfire, he had seen the wounded coming back, and he knew what was coming next. He ordered his Canadians to dig deeper, to stockpile every grenade, every magazine, every belt of machine gun ammunition. He told his officers something they would never forget. If we lose this hill, the road to Seoul is open. At 10 p.m. on April 24th, the Chinese came. The 118th Division had been reinforced. This wasn't 10,000 men anymore. This was a fresh assault, with fresh troops, and they came at Hill 677 from 3 sides. The Canadians were ready. D Company of the Princess Patricia's was on the most exposed slope. They watched the Chinese climb in the moonlight, and they waited until the enemy was 30 meters away before opening fire. The first wave was destroyed in less than 2 minutes. A second wave came up, then a third. By midnight, D Company was completely surrounded. Captain Wally Mills, the company commander, did something that has been studied in military academies ever since. He radioed his New Zealand artillery support, the same 16th Field Regiment that had supported the Australians. And he gave them coordinates, his own coordinates. Think about that for a moment. A company commander surrounded by enemy forces, calling artillery fire directly down on his own men. He was betting the lives of every soldier under his command on the fact that their trenches were deeper than the Chinese could imagine. He was betting that the New Zealand gunners, 5 miles away, would put their shells exactly where he told them to. And he was betting that the Chinese, exposed in the open, would die faster than the Canadians dug into their bunkers. It was the kind of decision that ends careers, or ends lives, or in this case, wins battles. He called artillery fire directly on top of his own position. The shells came in seconds later, whining through the air, exploding all around the Canadian trenches. The Chinese, caught in the open, were annihilated. The Canadians, dug deep in their bunkers, survived. By dawn on April 25th, the Chinese assault on Hill 677 had broken. The Canadians had held. When the sun rose on April 25, 1951, the battlefield around Kapyong was unrecognizable. The hills were littered with bodies. Estimates vary, but the Chinese 118th Division lost at least 1,000 killed at Kapyong. Some historians put the number closer to 2,000. The Commonwealth losses: 32 Australians killed, 59 wounded, 10 Canadians killed, 23 wounded. The Chinese Fifth Phase Offensive, the largest attack of the entire war, had been stopped. Seoul did not fall. In the valleys around Kapyong, Australian and Canadian soldiers walked the battlefield in silence. They counted their dead. They marked positions where friends had fallen. Some men sat down on the cold ground and didn't move for hours. The battle was over, but for the men who fought it, the war they had just survived would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Many of them, decades later, would still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the whistles, hearing the cymbals, hearing the screams of men running uphill in the dark. The American command did something they had never done before and would only do once more in the entire Korean War. They awarded the United States Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit-level award in the American military, to a foreign unit, to 3 RAR, to the Princess Patricias, to the New Zealand 16th Field Regiment, 3 Commonwealth units honoured by the United States for stopping the Chinese Army and the Chinese commander of the 118th Division. After the war, he returned to China. He was promoted, but for the rest of his life he refused to speak publicly about what happened at Kapyong. When asked, late in his life, what went wrong, he gave only one answer: "We did not know who we were fighting." Today, 75 years later, Kapyong is barely remembered outside of Australia and Canada. There is no Hollywood movie, no Netflix documentary, no best-selling book. But every year, on April 24th, Australian soldiers gather at a small memorial in Kapyong Valley. Canadian soldiers gather at a stone monument in Ottawa. They remember the 700 men who held a hill against 10,000, who stopped an army, who saved a city, and who came home and were told the war they fought in was already being called the Forgotten War. If this story moved you, there are more like it. More forgotten battles, more forgotten units, more forgotten men who changed history with nothing but discipline, courage, and the orders to hold. In the next video, we tell the story of the Turkish Brigade at Kunuri, 300 men, bayonet charges, and the moment Chinese soldiers refused to attack them ever again. The link is on your screen now. Subscribe to War Memory Files and we'll keep finding these stories, story by story, until none of them are forgotten.